Okay, so I'd like to begin today's session, which is our keynote, Thinking Outside the Blocks with Lego. I thank everybody for joining us. As many of you know, I'm Donna Frazier, Senior Vice President of Privacy Initiatives at BBB National Programs, as well as the Program Director for CARU. You can go to the next slide now. Thank you. So just a few housekeeping sessions for today's webinar. As many of you have already attended, you know that all participants' microphones are muted. The session is being recorded and it will be available online. You'll receive an email of how to make yourself available to that recording. And if at any time you need technical help, please contact support@bbbnp.org. We have two more sessions for our CARU Conference virtual series. The next one is November 17th, Why Diversity and Inclusion is Good for Business, and our last one for the year, CARU Now, then I'm looking forward on December 8th, so please do register for those upcoming sessions. Today obviously can't be done without the work of our sponsors, the help of our sponsors, so I'd like to call them out specifically: Google, Hypershift, Keller and Heckman, Microsoft, Super Awesome, Venable, Manat, Baker Hostetler, and of course, Davis and Gilbert. So today we have Mike Moynihan from Lego, who is the Vice President for the Lego Group, the world's largest toy company. He's had 25 years of consumer marketing experience, and his role has been bolstering Lego Group's innovation, branding, marketing, partnerships, and capability building efforts. Prior to his current role, he led the marketing function at the Lego Group business unit for 5 years. And in that capacity, he oversaw brand management, shopper marketing, event marketing, public relations, partnerships, promotions, content marketing, marketing planning, and strategic planning. So clearly, Mike is the perfect person to speak about how to think outside the box. So I will turn it over to Mike. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Donna. Thrilled to be here and honored that we've been asked to share our perspective here. We have enormous respect for CARU and the work that they do, and have really profoundly appreciated the partnership over the years. So happy to engage here. I know the theme of this was sort of getting to yes, and that is something that we definitely strive to do on a daily basis, but admittedly, it's not always easy. So what I plan to share here is neither a blueprint nor a sermon. We don't have all the answers on this. And I think we've stumbled in this space just like anybody else. And nor do I believe that a one size fits all is appropriate for every company. I mean, we all have, different values, different contexts in which we operate. And so what I plan to share here is just simply our story and how we try to get to yes. And I hope that it can be of some degree of inspiration to everybody on their journey to getting to yes. But first, maybe what I thought would be a helpful place to start is to provide you a little bit of background on Lego as a company. I think some of you may be familiar with Lego as a brand, but perhaps not as much on Lego as a company. So maybe on the next slide, we have just a few fun facts here on Lego as a company. We actually are a privately held, family-owned company based out of Denmark, and we started in 1932. It is estimated that we have been, or about 100 million kids a year globally play with Lego for roughly about 5 billion hours a year. And there are roughly about 102 Lego bricks for each of the world's inhabitants. Lego minifigures are in fact the world's largest population, and we are actually the world's largest tire manufacturer too. So those are some little fun facts about Lego. So next slide. Just gives you a little bit of a sense for the degree to which we operate as a more purpose-driven company. So as I mentioned, we are a privately held company. The Lego Foundation owns roughly 25% of the Lego Group, which means basically that 25% of our operating profits are directed to the Lego Foundation every year, which by corporate standards is a pretty high percentage. So the Lego Foundation does some extraordinary work in terms of research around play and learning, and also a lot in the way of charitable giving to provide Lego play experiences to roughly 20 million deserving kids throughout the globe every year. So next slide. picking up on this point around being a purpose-driven company, our mission is to inspire and develop the builders of tomorrow. And this is something that we established probably about 20 years ago now. It was really driven, to be honest with you, by a lot of the stories that have come in. We hear constantly of people who, in their adult years became either engineers or architects or astronauts, who even actually the founders of Google allegedly were inspired by Lego building growing up. And so we sort of adopted that idea that the reason we get out of bed every day is to inspire and develop the builders of tomorrow. So that's our ultimate brand mission. And the next slide is our belief, which is essentially that children are not just the consumers of our products, but they're actually our role models as well. And the reason that we say this is that children are naturally and very innately curious, creative, and imaginative. And something sort of happens along the way through childhood as we get through our schooling years and into adulthood, that we tend to oftentimes lose that curiosity and that playfulness and creativity. And what we try to do is hold our end users up as role models for the degree to which we need to maintain those traits as we get older. That if we want to build our own future, that's going to be pretty important. Then on the next slide, it provides sort of a one-page snapshot here of what we call our brand framework. And on the first part of that there, the mission, I've already shared that. We have an aspiration here to globalize and innovate the Lego system in play. And in particular, what our aim is to be more of a force for learning through play. I think oftentimes what we're seeing is that play is seen as a pretty indulgent activity, and the amount of free play that kids have now is much less than it was 20 years ago. And so we're trying to fight that trend because we believe that there is enormous benefit to kids learning through play, and particularly through the right kinds of play. A very important part of this chart, though, are the yellow boxes, and those are the brand promises that we have to the various stakeholder groups which we serve. So we have our play promise toward consumers. We have our partner promise toward the various business partners that we work with, retail partners, licensing partners, et cetera. We have our people promise, which is the brand promise to our employees. If you come to work for Lego, what can you expect from our brand? And then we have the planet promise in terms of the kind of impact that we want to leave on society. So I think what you might be able to gather from this is that we aim to be a very stakeholder-driven company, and I'll touch back on this chart in a little bit to talk about how that actually comes to life. And the core kind of mantra that we have, started by the founder, is that only the best is good enough for kids, and that comes through very much in the quality value that we have, and then all of the other values that are listed there. So that's sort of just the one-page snapshot on our brand and what it stands for. So then the next slide. So I think then another really important element to address here regarding the business is we're fortunate to have a pretty robust business. We are actually the world's largest toy brand, and as Donna mentioned, we're the world's largest toy manufacturer. We also have a pretty robust ecosystem of proprietary touch points that have a fair amount of reach to them. And maybe on the next slide, it just showcases, and I'm not going to go through all of the detail on this, but when you take a look at, sorry, on the next slide, the various touch points that we have, whether or not that is kids playing with our toy products. We have roughly 100 million people going through our retail stores every year. We have a lot of engagement in our digital platforms. We have Legoland attractions, which draw roughly 20 million people a year. Our video games is a really robust business. So across all of these, you can see the numbers. Our scale is actually quite significant. And my point in the last two slides here is not to boast or brag about it at all. It's actually quite the contrary, to say that we are hitting a lot of people, and we've got a lot of reach with this. And that, along with our mission as a company, carries a lot of responsibility to make sure that we're acting in an ethical and high integrity way. So that places quite a high premium on our efforts to get to yes in the right way and make sure that we're being very values led in how we market. So that's a bit of the overview on Lego as a whole. And I think on the next slide, it really sort of poses the primary question that I wanted to try to come to here, which is what makes it difficult to get to yes, and what are some of the ways in which we have found that we can help do that. And really, there are two general areas that that I'd like to address in this. One is on the next slide is sort of the first one, which is around competing priorities. And these can make it really hard to be very values-led as a company. I think most companies have very genuine ambitions to be responsible corporate citizens, but at the same time, they're also in business to make money, and sometimes that objective can be at odds with their ambitions to be responsible. So if there's lack of clarity on how to prioritize when faced with any potential trade-offs like that, it can be pretty difficult to get to yes. And so we found a few different mechanisms that can be helpful in addressing that. And those are outlined on the next slide here. And I'll plan to go into a bit of detail on each of these, but one is the KPI structure. And I'll go back to the Lego brand framework and reference that as a way of illustrating this point. So our KPIs, our key performance indicators, are essentially all about how people get bonused. And what we've done is we've identified essentially 5 main, what we call pinnacle KPIs. These are the things that, again, everybody is actually bonused on. One of those KPIs is our own profit as a company. However, that metric is no more than 20% of anybody's bonus. We then also have individual KPIs, and they're hard metrics for each one of these brand promises. So we have a very clear metric around NPS for our play promise and delivering for consumers. We have a survey results that are driven, or that give us a sense for how we're doing with our partners. Likewise for our employees, and then we work with RepTrack to track our brand reputation and its impact on society. So those constitute the other 4 metrics in our bonus program. So the point here is that for any Lego employee, no more than 20% of their bonus is actually going to be driven by our profit. The vast majority of their bonus is really based on how well they're delivering for stakeholders. And the logic behind that is that if we actually do a really good job with all of our various stakeholders, a natural byproduct of that is that we will ultimately see it come back to us. And and you might say, well, that's fine for a privately held company. You can have lower profit standards and be altruistic in that regard. But I can tell you, when we instituted this about 20 years ago, significant increase in our profitability. And even if you take a look at our performance over the last 20 years or so, we've been fortunate to sustain well above the industry average in terms of profits. So this isn't necessarily a trade-off between doing good and being profitable. It's actually being really super stakeholder focused, and then letting that really guide what you think and how you act. And so for us, this KPI structure helps us to avoid situations in which employees might feel compelled to deliver on profit at any cost. And so knowing where the weights are in their bonus system helps to make the right trade-offs. The next slide outlines the second thing that we have found that's helpful oftentimes in dealing with competing priorities, and that is a very clear statement of beliefs and supporting policies. And there are a few key areas in which our values and our beliefs around responsibly marketing to kids set a much higher standard than what's required by the law. And we found that it's really helpful to be pretty unambiguous in internally stating those beliefs and socializing policies that support them. So for example, there are 3 here that I'll bring you through. Probably about 15 years ago, and this was actually during the height of concerns around childhood obesity, our owner came down with a very rare directive. He's not a very hands-on person, but in this particular case, he basically instituted a rule that we would no longer engage in co-promotions with food companies. And for the simple reason that he just didn't want our brand to be used to lure children into unhealthy eating habits. So he instituted a very clear and sweeping rule to avoid any ambiguity. And there have been a few exceptions along the way as we've worked with, for example, theatrical movies where our partners have had to do QSR promotions or things like that. But on the whole, for our core toy business, we've not done a food co-promotion for the last 15 years. And there's basically no discussion around that. And so I think having that, as a very clear directive helped avoid any ambiguity and helped us deliver to our values. Second thing is no work with paid influencers under the age of 13. And, there was a toy inventor who was recently interviewed by Forbes, and he was quoted as saying that the toy industry realizes that the best way to market is to have kids do the marketing for them. Now, I, of course, can't speak on behalf of the rest of the toy industry, but this does not represent our point of view at all. Although I would imagine that the fact that there's an 8-year-old that makes over $20 million a year as a YouTube influencer for toys and games probably suggests that we are in the minority on that point of view. But we're just not convinced that it's in the best interest of either the influencers or the influencees when kids under the age of 13 are enlisted to market products in that way. So last year, we instituted a formal policy prohibiting the use of paid influencers under the age of 13. Again, it was a very top-down directive, no dialogue or discussion about it. This is what our values are, and that's that. The third one also came about last year, and I'm sure many companies were struggling with some of the challenges with YouTube early on last year. And I know the folks at Google did a lot of work to address those, which is great. But in the moment, we really had to basically follow suit with a lot of other companies, which is to halt advertising temporarily and really take a look at how we're operating in that space. And it ultimately led to a whitelisting approach where we actually significantly reduced our advertising in the YouTube space and other spaces to make sure that we were actually adhering to our values and operating in that space in a way that we felt comfortable with. Now, of course, it ultimately meant a pretty significant reduction in our advertising, as I mentioned, and it also meant increased premiums in terms of the cost of the advertising that we have. We've partnered quite a bit with one of your sponsors, Super Awesome, who've been great in this process, but it did ultimately mean that the overall efficiency of our buy ended up going down. But again, we had a very top-down perspective on this, that this is what we need to do to be able to be compliant with our values. And so we accepted that trade-off. So that's the second area. The third area is clarity in our business model, and that's on the next slide. While our brand plays very extensively in the media and entertainment spaces, we've made a very clear and deliberate choice that we are not a media or entertainment company. So in other words, our brand definitely operates in the video game space, the theatrical space, the TV space, et cetera. But our business is not super heavily reliant in those areas. And that's a very important distinction on a couple different levels. First of all, we, as a result, don't accept advertising on any of our branded platforms or channels. So we would just rather deliver a very pure experience to our consumers. And that ultimately yields a lack of any kind of pressure to accept and grow advertising revenue. And ultimately, that takes this whole series of issues off the table. How much advertising should we take? Which advertisers would be appropriate? How much influence should advertisers have over our editorial and our consumer experience? All those issues go off the table when we say that we're not a media company. Secondly, we're also not an entertainment company. Again, our brand plays in the entertainment space for sure, but our revenues are not dramatically tied, at least directly, to what we ultimately derive off of licensing fees in the entertainment space. And that, again, helps us to avoid any major pressures around launching forms of content or entertainment initiatives that might force us to compromise our values for the sake of driving a particular revenue target in that space. And so being super clear on our business model. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that companies that are in the media and entertainment space are not able to adhere to values. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just saying that in our case, by more tightly defining our business model, it has helped free us from a lot of other more difficult conversations. The final area to mention here on the next slide is senior level advocacy and support. And I've already sort of mentioned this to a degree, and I'm sure it probably goes without saying, but after the brand and child safety concerns that surfaced on YouTube last year, we took the same decision that many other companies took, which is to temporarily halt our advertising on YouTube until we could get further clarity and assurances on the next steps for course correction. But what happened there is our brand governance team, in conjunction with our media agency, made a very quick decision to halt our advertising. And literally the next day, I updated our executive leadership team on that decision. And there was universal and immediate support, despite the fact that we had no idea what the commercial consequence of that was going to be. But it wasn't even a question. And I think having that support and backing from the most senior levels in the organization is just indispensable for dealing with any of these potential areas that might cause internal resistance. So Anyway, so those are anyway some of the things that we have found that can help in dealing with competing priorities. So that then leads to the next challenge when it comes to getting to yes and being more values led, and that's on the next slide here, which is that oftentimes I think we as marketers to children can feel a lack of perceived control. So maybe on the next slide. Sorry, thanks. So what I wanted to do to bring that one to life here is provide some inspiration from an anti-smoking campaign, believe it or not. And there's a great new book launched in the spring by Jonah Berger called The Catalyst. And in there, he tells a story about a TV ad campaign that ran about 20 years ago in Florida. And when I read this, I couldn't help but be inspired by the campaign and specifically this topic of getting to yes for companies. And on the next slide, it shows who the campaign was run by. It was actually run by an organization called Truth, the Truth Initiative. And their objective was to ultimately get teenagers to quit smoking. And what was interesting is when you hear some of the, or when I read the history around this, I was kind of amazed. In the late 1990s, smoking was the biggest public health crisis facing the country at that time. It was responsible for about 20% of all deaths at the time, with an estimated economic cost of about $150 billion a year in the US. And it was particularly acute among teens. And these numbers blew me away. Almost 3/4 of high school students had smoked, and 25% of them reported smoking daily. And those rates were at a 19-year high in the late 90s and climbing. And that was despite, or you could even say because of, extensive efforts by regulators and nonprofits to get kids to stop or not to start. So Truth ran a very simple but enormously effective campaign. In fact, it was so effective that it became the subject of a lawsuit filed by tobacco companies. And for that reason, I couldn't even find the spot on YouTube. And I was able to source it through an ad agency, but our legal counsel had advised that I not show it here publicly, but I can explain it. It's quite a simple concept. There are two teenagers sitting in a living room, and they place a phone call to a magazine executive to ask why his publication accepts advertising for cigarettes, given that a high share of their readership is youths. So the executive replies by saying that they do also support anti-tobacco ads. And then one of the teenagers asks whether or not they would be willing to do that for a public service. In other words, not charge anti-tobacco nonprofits for advertising. And the executive said no, and when pressed by the teens, he said, well, look, we're in the business to make money. So then one of the teens asks, well, is this about people or is it about money? And frustrated by the question, the executive just says, well, publishing is about money, and then he hangs up. So that campaign was run in Florida, and after a few months, it led to over 30,000 Florida teens to quit smoking. And then within a couple of years, it cut teen smoking rates in half. And then it was so successful that it was scaled nationally, and over the course of the national campaign, teen smoking rates dropped by 75%. So I'm sharing this story with you for two reasons. The first and probably the most obvious is the reminder that the challenges of responsibly marketing to children are not new. I mean, this ad campaign took place well before all the various digital platforms that present challenges today. And the frequent misalignment between the interest and well-being of kids, advertisers, and media platforms is obviously not a new phenomenon. But the second and much more important reason for me to share this is why the campaign works so well and what I think we can take away as inspiration. The Truth Organization did a ton of research and work with teenagers to understand why exactly they smoked in the first place, despite knowing that it wasn't good for them. And the insight that they found was that it comes down to asserting control. So freedom and control are basic human needs, and particularly important for teenagers and probably kids more broadly as well, who don't believe that they have enough of control. They're constantly being subjected to the rules of parents or teachers or coaches, etc. So many teens smoke as a way to assert their control in response to adults who are constantly telling them what they should or shouldn't do. So the brilliance of this Truth campaign is that they flipped that insight on its head to get kids to quit smoking. So the campaign impressed upon teenagers that they were being manipulated by tobacco and media companies. So teens then took that upon themselves to assert their own control against being manipulated by quitting smoking. And so what's really interesting here is that you can stop bad behavior or you can start good behavior as a matter of simply asserting control. And I couldn't help but think about that within the context of marketing to children. So like teens, marketers to children may often feel that they lack control, particularly when it comes to reaching kids. I mean, the marketplace now is more difficult. At least the conventional wisdom suggests that there are only so few ways to reach kids today. The shift in viewing away from a lot of kid-targeted TV broadcasters is leading to fewer advertised supporting platforms. So the shift from channels like Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network to walled gardens like Netflix or Disney Plus just offers less advertising opportunity. Likewise, at the same time, you've got shift in viewing, going more toward large video platforms like YouTube and TikTok, which were not initially designed with children's privacy and safety in mind. And so based on this, marketers could rightly feel like they have a necessary trade-off to make between reaching their commercial goals and adhering to the values around responsibly marketing to children. But our experience has taught us that we may actually have more control than we think. So if I were to go back to the policies that I had mentioned earlier, so maybe just on the next slide, just as a refresher here, if we go back to the food co-promotion, sorry, if we can go to the next slide. Sorry, and the next, yeah, okay, thanks. So on the first click here, the food co-promotions, when our owner gave the directive on that 20 years ago, you can imagine the response among our marketing community. For those of you who have worked with Happy Meal promotions or cereal box promotions, and particularly at that time, there was nothing as effective or efficient as those in terms of marketing for a brand. I think most companies would kill to get a slate on the Happy Meal calendar. And so I think marketers, when they took a look at that, were just saying, this is apocalyptic. How in the world are we ever going to replace those parts of our marketing mix? Well, not long after that decision, we tried something that we'd never done before. We approached Lucasfilm and Cartoon Network with an idea that we had for a pilot to do a 5-minute mini movie around Lego Star Wars. So it was an animated short that would celebrate the Lego Star Wars or the Star Wars saga told in a Lego setting. And it was wildly successful and ultimately spawned the very successful run that we've had into the world of Lego branded entertainment content. The timing of these two events is not a coincidence. The constraint that prohibited us from relying on Happy Meal promotions forced us to think in a more transformative way about how to innovate our marketing model. So we were forced to exert our control and found another gear into which we could kick our marketing model. And moreover, one that did not force us to compromise our values. Now, our business is roughly about 6 times the size that it was when the no food co-promotion policy was enacted. So, and I guarantee you, no marketer in our company ever would have projected that at the time that the policy was enacted. So necessity was indeed the mother of invention. So this is a good case in point where constraints can actually drive innovation. The next point, if you just click again, thanks. When you take a look at the 2 policies that we had in the online video space of whitelisting and then restricting work with influencers under the age of 13, ultimately when you take a look at those, I mean, you would have thought that we were at a huge competitive disadvantage by taking those moves on, and because there's a lot of conventional wisdom about the power of those digital platforms and those particular tactics. And if you bought into that conventional wisdom, a very logical question that you would have is, well, how much did your business and market share decline in 2019 as a result of this and sticking to your values? Well, on the next slide, you can see that our business actually didn't decline. In fact, it grew 5.5% versus 2018 in an industry that was down 3%. So we grew our business and our market share despite the self-imposed policies that challenged a lot of the conventional wisdom. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that our experience here proves that these platforms and the tactics don't drive demand. Of course they do. There are plenty of examples of companies that are leveraging these tactics and growing very well. What I am suggesting is that they're not the only ways to drive demand. So we realized that the menu of options that we had to select from is much broader than we had originally thought. It included a whole set of initiatives that didn't require that we compromise our values. And so it just required asserting our control. So you may be wondering, well, how in the world did we do this? So on the next slide, we just have a few examples of ways in which we did this. The first is that we increased our marketing investment overall. And that was very helpful because we realized that, in order to effectively break through and stick to our values, we're going to need to invest more. But it turned out to be the right thing to do. We also tapped into the trend in which parents and kids are now spending more time together. and that's only accelerated quite a bit during these COVID months. So what we ultimately did there is to pivot and to market our brand much more to families rather than strictly either to kids or to adults. And that has proven to be super helpful, and I'll touch on that in a second. We also invested very heavily behind our own touch points. So, all of the reach that I had shared with you in a few slides ago around our own touch points, we really significantly invested and grew that reach. In fact, just to give you a sense, the number of kids that we reached in our own digital platforms went from about 14 million in 2018 to 34 million in 2019, because we know that if we have control over the kind of experience that's delivered there, we can feel really good about the quality of the experience. And so it's because of that part of the marketing investment that we had was to basically build our own platforms that have the standards that we want. And then finally, we also engaged and had very strong engaged with very strong marketing and licensing partners to expand our reach in other ways that are more consistent with our values. And so, great partnerships with folks like Disney or Warner Brothers or even NASA. We did major programs with. Those were also ways of extending our reach and getting our brand more visible, so that we again weren't beholden to conditions that were not conforming to our values. So far more important than all the tactics, though, we used was the mindset that we can assert our control to grow our business in a way that's not consistent with our values. So, and what I would say is that, on the next slide, we're not the only company doing this either. On the next slide here, this is just an example of sort of the one thing that all of these brands have in common is that they've either stopped doing business with Amazon or never started. And again, that's for being in the consumer product space. A lot of the conventional wisdom holds that you simply have to sell on Amazon, otherwise it's suicide for a brand. Roughly 2/3 of online product searches start there. I think we've all heard that. And while there are concerns that some brands have regarding Amazon's terms or their third-party marketplace, et cetera, most perceive that as they're having limited control. That it's either accept the conditions on Amazon or suffer severe commercial penalties by not taking part in that platform. But the brands I've just outlined here have definitely bucked that conventional wisdom. Now, I certainly don't have an opinion on whether or not they're making the right business decision, but my point is that they've decided that they're not beholden to the conventional wisdom and that they are asserting their control. I think on the next slide, a really important enabler to asserting your control is deep understanding. And this is where investing in insights becomes really important. And a good example here is this insight that I shared about kids and parents spending a lot more time together. An insight that we came across was that 84% of parents today say that they're heavily involved in their kids' screen time. So that actually opened up a lot of options for us. So realizing that co-viewing and co-experience is increasingly important, it all of a sudden opened up a ton of viable alternatives for us. We actually launched last year a program called Rebuild the World, which is our first global brand campaign in over 30 years. But this is something that we actually marketed the brand directly to families. And that proved to be extremely successful for us. We also launched a television program on Fox earlier this year called Lego Masters, which was intended to gear itself right toward the co-viewing area where kids and parents are watching together. And it was a great opportunity. For those of you not familiar with the show, it was actually a reality-based concept in which people compete to become a Lego master builder. So it was another opportunity for us to tap into this trend and ultimately leverage a whole new way of driving interest and awareness for our brand. So, and we're far from the only brand doing this as well. I mean, another good example on the next slide is featuring Adidas. And there was an article featured in Marketing Week a little while ago in which Adidas went through a journey where they discovered through much better analytics that their marketing model was becoming way overinvested in lower funnel digital media channels and way underinvested in upper funnel channels, which drive awareness and interest. So they discovered that they were relying very heavily on the digital platforms that they were advertising on for their insights. And not surprisingly, when you rely heavily on those digital platforms, they're going to advise you to spend much more on those platforms. But ultimately, when they took control of their own insights and analytics and created their own engine, what they realized is that their spending balance was way off. And so it has now empowered them to move money from the lower funnel part of the mix to the upper funnel part, and now they're growing their overall user base in a much bigger way. So again, I think this is really about driving true understanding and really deep insights that can unlock really good potential and ideas for innovation, and again allow you to assert your control in ways that that you may not have realized before. At least that's been our experience for sure. So I would say that the best way to sum up this point around asserting control is perhaps on the next slide, which is a famous quote from Henry Ford of, "Whether you think you can or you can't, you're right." So just maybe on the next slide here. And I would say that that's within the context of getting to yes, whether or not you think you can or you can't, you're right. So anyway, so those are just some of the key lessons that we've learned. And I hope that they're helpful to you on your journey. And as I mentioned before, we certainly don't have all the answers, but these are some experiences that that we have found helpful, and hopefully you do as well. So there's one final note before I close, and we can then certainly open it up for question. And that is that it might be easy for you to hear our story and say, well, yeah, it's kind of easy for a brand like Lego to do this stuff because, they're privately held and they're a large brand, and, and for sure we benefit significantly from those conditions. But being privately held doesn't reduce our accountability for business results. And in fact, when we enacted our whitelisting policy last year, and I was telling you that I went to our executive leadership team and informed them of our decision, and they gave full support. But it's important to note that they did not give me any relief on our commercial targets. That was just another headwind that we needed to manage on the way to delivering what we promised. And so, and ultimately we were able to do that. Likewise, I think maybe taking good inspiration from a company like Allbirds, which is a startup brand entering into a really crowded and cutthroat market like footwear, and not making the decision to not sell on Amazon. They're doing something right because they have a very thriving business. They're a much smaller company than we are. And they're being very clear on their priorities and their purpose, and they're asserting their control accordingly. And so I don't think that, you have to be necessarily a large brand or privately held to be able to assert your control. So anyway, I just wanted to close by giving profound thanks to the folks at CARU, not only for inviting our perspective here, but most especially for the great partnership over the years and helping us get to yes. They've been an integral partner to that. And I would only say that probably the single best learning that we've had over the years on how to get to yes is that CARU is an invaluable partner and should definitely be leveraged very heavily in the process here. So with that, I'm happy to take any comments or questions.
Thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate that. I have a couple of questions. One is I'm just going to go back and pivot to what you just said about asserting control and talking about Allbirds. So let's assume that you have the opportunity to give some advice to a small startup about really how to assert control from the outset, or do you? Do you wait until you have a more established brand? What do you do?
Yeah, and I think probably the best thing to do would be to study a company like Allbirds. In fact, there's a great feature article on them, excuse me, in the most recent issue of Fortune. And I do think that being very purpose-driven is quite helpful in guiding choices around things. And if you have a purpose that really resonates with people, all of a sudden, I think it provides really good clarity in what's in and out of bounds for you as a company. But also, I think you can fairly readily rely on the fact that if your purpose is important enough to your consumers, you will be able to drive demand without necessarily being beholden to platforms or other companies in the way that you might think. But again, I don't have a lot of experience in startups. I've been with Lego for a very long time, so I would probably defer more to an experience with a company like Allbirds, because anything beyond what I've just mentioned would be just pure conjecture on my part.
I mean, would you say that there's a distinction that needs to be made between product and brand, right? So for Lego, your product obviously are the bricks, but the brand is much bigger than that. And establishing the relationship with the consumers, it's like I say this sometimes to when at K when we're talking about these things, it's like a courting relationship, right? Where you're both strangers, you learn who your consumer is, your consumer learns who you, the brand, are, and they fall in love with the product.
Yep, absolutely.
And does that falling in love with the product ultimately lend to falling in love with the brand? Is that how you establish that long-term relationship?
Yeah, and I think that the only thing that I would add to that, because I think that's absolutely true, the only thing that I would add to that has certainly been true in our case is that it's how they fall in love with the product that can ultimately either drive trust and love for the brand or not. So I think this is what one of the mantras that I mentioned here that's important to our business is that only the best is good enough. And so that applies not only to our product experience, but it also applies to our call center or going into Lego stores or any of the marketing that we do, the entertainment content that we do. Having a very, very high quality standard ultimately is a signal. So the brand is not just the product; it's
Mhm.
actually also a signal and sort of a source of trust, if you will, if you're really delivering on that. So for us, I think that's it's all starts with the product and having a super high quality product. But by again thinking about the ideal of our brand, it has allowed us to innovate into different spaces, but doing so within a context of what is our mission ultimately about, and how do we make sure that we're adhering to those quality standards in everything we do.
So one thing that you said is interesting is that Lego is neither a media or entertainment company. Um, does it matter what the consumer's perception may be? Because they may perceive you as such because of Lego Masters, because of the movies, because of the amusement park. Does it matter? And if it does matter, how do you work with the optics of that perception?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it matters to the consumer. I mean, ultimately, they see our brand operating in those spaces. I guess the point I was trying to make there was that, based on where our business is anchored, it allows us to make certain choices as to what the consumer ultimately sees. And so, if all of a sudden we were to now say that we're a media company and we need to derive, a lot more advertising revenue on our YouTube channel or even on our digital platforms, now all of a sudden, if consumers start to see that we are making some choices like accepting ads that might be questionable, or we're compromising the overall quality of the experience in any way to accommodate advertising, then all of a sudden they would start to see that we're not the brand that they thought that we were. And so I think that's the key. You're right, it is semantics as far as what our business strategy is, but I think the key is that our business strategy ultimately reflects how we show up to consumers.
Can you speak to some of the possible pushback or consequences that Lego has received in deciding, not to engage with influencers or not advertising with food companies, those types of things that you pointed out?
Yeah, I can tell you, with the new or the no food co-promotion policy has been a really big pain point with some of our partners. So, as an example, with our theatrical releases, imagine working with a company like Warner Brothers to distribute films, and you say, well, you can't have a Happy Meal promotion to
Right.
launch a film, right? I mean, those are table stakes for the
Mhm.
children's film industry. Likewise, we have a third-party partner in Merlin Entertainment who runs all of our Legoland attractions. Again, food co-promotions are a bit of table stakes in that environment, and so we've had to make some compromises with those partners just out of respect for their business and their business models. So I think those are definitely some cases in which externally we've sort of negotiated to come to compromise. Internally, there's less compromise that goes on, to be honest. I think that, again, with the three things that I've mentioned there, for as collaborative and consensus driven as our culture can tend to be, there are certain areas where we are pretty top down, and that's when it comes to our brand. And so I think that helps reduce a lot of the friction and noise internally.
Um, I have to imagine that there are so many companies and other brands that would gladly partner with Lego. So, what are some of the considerations that you all undertake in the decision-making process to decide to partner with somebody?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think one of the things is obviously the degree of relevance for our audience, and so making sure that we are partnering with a brand that people can look at and evaluate and say, okay, this is a marriage that makes a lot of sense, and it resonates with me as a consumer. And so consumer fit, I think, is super important. Values fit is also super important. So as an example, we've just announced a partnership with Adidas, and Adidas is taking a very interesting position within the athletic space around creativity and the importance of creativity as an athlete. So there's really good brand fit and alignment there. I think a third thing that we look at, to be honest, and this goes back to the partner promise that we have in our brand framework, is can we add sufficient value to that partner? So just as an example, when we look at opportunities for licensing, there are some properties that don't lend themselves as well to construction toys. Things that are particularly character-based or that don't have a lot of vehicles or structures or things like that that lend themselves well to building. We don't think that we can add a whole lot of value to those properties. And so, and the reality around this is that the partnerships that we enter into, we really want to be genuinely sustaining. And in our history and experience, the only way that you can have sustaining partnerships is if both parties are winning. And so we do try to look at it through the lens of, can we really add enough value to the partner to make it sustaining? So I'd say those are the three really big things that we look at.
Thank you. One final question before we wrap up. Kind of a little bit off topic, but I'd be curious to know what the impact of COVID has been on LEGO.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we've been super fortunate that, and I think the toy industry in general has been quite fortunate, to be honest with you, that the conditions have been such that it has really inspired people to re-engage with toys more generally. And we have benefited from that at least as much as some of our other cohorts in the toy industry on a couple of different dimensions. Of course, one is that you have less competition from experiences. So a lot of, whether it's theme parks or movie theaters or vacations, people are just spending a lot less money on those. And so toys become a natural way of engaging. The other thing is that we're finding that, adults, as they are cooped up now, they are looking for ways to both de-stress and also find comfort. And that can often come through nostalgia and going back to their childhood. So you're seeing huge uptakes in the board game category and also with Lego building. So we've seen, again, a huge surge in our volume with adults who are building just for themselves. The third thing that we're seeing with COVID is that families are spending a lot more time together. And so we're finding that there's a huge increase in the incidence of families now building together. So whereas, in many cases, building used to be a more solitary activity, families are actually doing it now more together. So we have benefited significantly from all of that. So it's been for us, and I say this somewhat sheepishly because I'm very respectful of the fact that many, if not most, businesses have really struggled in these conditions, but we've been fortunate to see a different outcome.
Right. Thank you so much. And we really, truly appreciate LEGO's support of CARU and your ongoing partnership. And thank you again for taking the time to do this for us today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you. So now we can go to the next slide. I just want to remind people that CARU has an upcoming event, Kidvertising 101, which is a 2-day seminar. Basically, CARU 101, you're going to hear from the CARU staff about advertising practices, privacy practices. I would encourage you or anyone on your team to register. And many of you also know that we are launching a new program, Teenage Privacy Program. Please reach out to me if you're interested in joining as a founding member or just as a general member. We're hoping to have a launch meeting mid-November of this year. And lastly, I want to thank you again. Our next session is November 17th, talking about diversity, inclusion, and why it's good for businesses. So thank you again for attending today's session.